Yeah, Mr. Ahmad goes first.
No, not now.
After I
No, but no. I'm not.
I'm just introduce you and sit
I don't know if you have that.
No, I
But it's not.
Wait a minute.
I think we're ready. When everyone else is ready, we're ready to go. Okay, yeah, you can say that she's currently working on a medical
Yeah, we start? Okay. All right, so we can begin. Hello, everyone. Welcome all to the final event of the Let's Talk About Palestine series, which is a series that has been such an important public forum for us here at the university, for all of us as an intellectual community to come together to think and reflect about Palestinian history, politics, the war on Gaza, on Palestinian literature today. So in that sense, I would like to thank the organizers of this series, for our colleagues from the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures for such an important work in making this possible for us. My name is Mohamed Wajdi Ben Hammed. I'm an assistant professor of comparative literature, of Arabic and comparative literature. And today, I'm very honored to moderate this conversation between my esteemed colleagues, Ahmad Diab and Stefania Pandolfo, on the question of Palestinian literature and the writing of trauma. The plan today is, for both of our speakers to give us their lectures, and Professor Diab will go first. After that, I will be, engaging with my colleagues in some remarks, reflections, and questions, and then we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. Okay. But let me first introduce my colleagues. First, we'll listen to a talk by Professor Ahmad Diab. He's Assistant Professor of Modern Arabic Literature and Middle Eastern Cinema at UC Berkeley. He specializes in the politics of culture and representation in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Palestinian art and intellectual production. His book entitled Intimate Others, Arabs through the Palestinian Gaze is forthcoming with Stanford University Press, and is the first study of its kind to explore how Palestinians represent non-Palestinian Arabs in literature and visual culture. Professor Diab's other research interests include Arab, exilic, and diasporic literatures, as well as the theory and practice of translation. And he has produced a number of very important translations of Mahmoud Darwish and the Syrian poet too, Mohamed al-Mahmoud. Alongside his academic writings, Professor Diab publishes creative fiction and poetry in both Arabic and English. Okay? So Professor Diab will be our first speaker for today. And then we will listen to the lecture by Professor Stefania Pandolfo, who is professor of anthropology at Berkeley. Her work centers questions of subjectivity, post-colonialism, and trauma in the Maghreb, and puts in conversation critical theory, psychoanalysis, and Islamic intellectual traditions. She has published extensively on Maghrebian modernity debates, post-colonial narratives of selfhood, and intercultural approaches to the issues of madness and mental illness. These diverse and critical interests are perhaps best reflected in her latest book, Not of the Soul, Madness, Psychoanalysis, and Islam, published by the University of Chicago Press, which is both, and the book is both an anthropological study and a deep critical reflection on the experiences of social and political violence in Morocco, the post-colonial institution of psychiatry, and Islamic practices of healing. Professor Pandolfo is currently working on a book on the aesthetic experience in the clinic, and which will be titled Art Cure. Thank you all, and please, we'll first have Professor Diab for the first lecture, so help me welcoming Professor Diab.
Thank you very much, Wajdi. Thank you for my colleagues, the organizers, Nora, Adam, Rita. Thank you for coming today. My talk is entitled, In Amina's Words, Language and Genocide in Gaza. On the southern edge of Doha, Qatar, and a mere 10-minute drive from its international airport, lies a Thumama, a modern and isolated residential complex with whitewashed walls that stretches along a city block. Over the last 4 months, a Thumama complex became the temporary home of a steadily increasing number of evacuees from Gaza. A weekly plane load of the recently made lands at DOH. Of course, it could have departed from GZA, for those who remember. In most cases, they come in pairs. One wounded person and one family caregiver. I recently facilitated a group writing therapy workshop with some of the Palestinian teenagers residing in Thumama. On our very first session, Amina, a 16-year-old young woman who had arrived in Doha as a caregiver for her wounded mother and sister 3 months prior, came ready with a notebook and 4 pages narrating the worst dawn of her life. If I may, and with her permission, I would like to start by reading an excerpt from what she wrote. سأروي لكم اليوم عن أحداث اليوم السيء الذي مررنا به. هذا اليوم المشؤوم، هذا اليوم يمر على كل مواطن فلسطيني يعيش في غزة الحبيبة. كنا نحن جالسين في غرفة العائلة ونتحدث عن الحرب وعن ماذا سيحل بنا، ونروي القصص والحكايات لبعضنا البعض ونضحك. ومن ثم تناولنا طعام العشاء وبقينا جالسين إلى أن ذهب كل منا إلى النوم في غرفته، وبقينا نائمين بسلام حتى الساعة 6 فجرا. هذه الساعة المشؤومة. أنا كنت نائمة في فراشي وأبي وأمي في غرفتهما. والدي صلى الفجر ومن ثم رجع إلى الفراش، وأمي جالسة على كرسي صلاتها لأنها لم تنتهي من الصلاة، وأختي المتزوجة وأولادها الاثنين نائمين بسلام في غرفة أخي، بينما أخي كان نائما في الغرفة الخارجية لمنزلنا، وأختي الثانية كانت في نفس الغرفة التي كنت فيها. صلت الفجر وسمعت أصوات القصف وخرجت إلى غرفة المعيشة المطلة على حديقة منزلها، فدخلت لها شظية من باب المنزل، اخترقت الباب الحديد وفاتت بقدمها وقطعت الشريان الرئيسي الذي يضخ الدم، ومن ثم سقطت أرضا ودمها ملأ المكان، ومن ثم صرخت وأمي وهي جالسة على كرسي صلاتها فاتت لها شظايا من السقف، حيث فاتت بعينها شظية أدت إلى انفجار العين، و5 شظايا في قدمها وكسر أيضا. وأخي خرج من الغرفة التي كان بها وهو قادم إلى الحمام ليتوضأ ليصلي الفجر. فاتت شظايا من حائط المنزل واخترقت يداه وقدماه، وأيضا كف يده الذي كان يحمل به الجوال الذي فاتت به شظية حمت يد أخي من البتر، الحمد لله. بعد كل هذه الأحداث التي مرت بها كل أفراد عائلتي، أختي المتزوجة وأطفالها استيقظوا من النوم على أصوات القصف العالية جدا. هذه الأصوات إلى الآن تدور في ذهني. أنا لا أنسى هذا اليوم السيء المعتم. قمت من النوم وأختي الثانية وأخي وأمي الذين يصرخون من الخوف والألم، كل هذا شاهدته. صحيت في هذا الوقت يا ليتني لم أصحو. فتحت عيناي لأجد غرفتي كلها رمل وحجار وضباب. لا أرى أي شيء في الغرفة، حتى باب الغرفة لا أراه. لكي أخرج كنت على سريري مغطاة ببطانية ثقيلة. هذه البطانية امتلأت شظايا. أجل، لقد حمتني البطانية. أحسست بشيء سخن يحرقني في قدمي، ثم قمت من سريري ورميت البطانية بقوة لأبعدها عني، ومن ثم صرخت صرخة بصوت عال مليء بالخوف. هذا الصوت الذي لن أنساه طوال حياتي. فقد ذكرت حينها بأن أبي وعائلتي قد هربوا ونسوني، فبدأت أصرخ حينها: أبي أبي أنا هنا، أبي أبي أنا هنا، أبي أرجوك لا تتركني وتذهب. فنادى علي بصوت عال، كان خائفا عماذا حصل بي. قال: نحن هنا متجمعون في هذه الغرفة، هيا اخرجي بسرعة. Amina's words, which I'm choosing to leave untranslated, puts us before an immediate question. What can language do at a time of active, ongoing genocide? What does bearing witness achieve if it's not going to put a stop to the violence being committed? Can the act of describing the horror amount to anything more? A series of larger and broader questions follow. What does art do? What does literature actually do at a time of industrial scale violence? Amina's words leave me with personal questions as well. What is the role of the academic, Palestinian academic, in a public American institution during a time of genocide enabled by the US government? What is the role of the Palestinian academic teaching at an institution that continues to deny the massacres, the suffering, the mere naming of the perpetrators. In some ways, the answer is speaking truth to power. But that answer has become cliche, peddled by leftists and left-leaning intellectuals and academics in the hallways of liberal institutions, at least for the past 2 decades. This worn-out slogan has now all of a sudden accrued unprecedented weight that comes with the full severity of the law. Does that mean that language matters? Does it mean that there is work for language to do during an ongoing atrocity? Are these even the proper questions? Or is it a different category altogether? It is true that no language, no singular work of art can stop a massacre. But then again, nothing else is. And furthermore, in so many ways, the war of Palestinians has always been a war of language, a war of propaganda, a war of PR. I do not claim that I am bringing answers, and personally I'm finding my answers elsewhere, not in the US, and not necessarily in the confines of an academic setting. But I am here to speak to you as an academic in this academic institution. I hope that whatever I have to share with you would be an invitation to ponder the Palestinian condition in the present moment and its often missing or occluded proper context. And to ask some of these difficult questions about the status, utility, and role of literature, of culture, precisely language, during an ongoing genocide. I would argue that modern Palestinian culture, be it visual or textual, is but one massive archive of texts that bear witness to various acts of erasure, annihilation, obliteration that are committed by Zionism. If Palestinian culture is the appropriate expression of Palestinian presence, then we must contend with the fact that Zionism forces an interpretation of that presence. Whether that interpretation is always attempting to overpower, to erase, or at least curtail that presence. Whether in the looting of thousands of books from the private libraries of Palestinians in 1948, or in the destruction of all 11 universities in Gaza during the ongoing genocide of 2023-2024. Zionism seeks to vacate Palestinians' presence of any intelligible coherence, whether it's to Palestinians themselves or to those who come into contact with them. Despite occasional lapses into opportunism and subpar writing, I contend that Palestinian authors in Gaza, which is one of the answers I'm finding, uplift and present some of the voices that have stood up to erasure and forces of annihilation in Gaza. That's one of the answers I'm proposing as a proper use of language here in the US, on the Ohlone territory. I would contend that authors in Gaza, whether penning novels, plays, poetry, or history, embark on a profoundly heroic venture. Their pursuit of self-definition, relentless autodidactic struggle stands unparalleled since the tumultuous events of the Palestine War of 1948, as it is known in Arab epistemology. and historiography. If you consider the host of historical, psychological, and aesthetic factors that they had to engage with and contend with, the modern history of the Gaza Strip since 1948 is deeply intertwined with the broader struggle for self-determination and liberation across the global South. Following the Arab-Israeli war, Egypt initially administered Gaza, but its people continued to resist Israeli occupation and assert their Palestinian identity. This is only possible to us today in 2024 because there were poets who wrote as early as the late 40s and as early as the early 50s of the life of the refugee, the Palestinian refugee. This repertoire is one of the reasons that we're able to speak of a Palestinian culture. Because for a long time, the complete eradication of the Palestinian people was considered fait accompli. One such voice is Harun Hashim Rashid, a Gaza native, born 1927, died in 2020. He's one of the earliest and most expressive. He penned some of the earliest and most expressive explorations of alienation amongst uprooted and dispossessed Palestinians after the Nakba. A Gaza native, Rashid bore witness to the demolition of homes by the British soldiers during his childhood, a traumatic event that he kept going back to in his poetry, and long-standing colonial practice upheld until this very day by the subsequent colonial power ruling over Palestine, the Israeli state. After obtaining a higher teacher training diploma from Gaza College, he worked as a teacher until 1954. And 1954 is the year he published one of his debut Diwan poetry collection, Ma'al Ghuraba, with strangers. And perhaps today, some of his poetry might ring as sappy, sentimental, replete with self-pity. Also, it echoes a gendered Arab, non-Palestinian Arab view of the Palestinian refugee. If you read the poetry and watch the films on the subject at the time, the Palestinian is often a hapless woman refugee in search of an Arab male savior. So in some of his poetry, we find echoes of this. Ma'al Ghuraba, the titular poem, for example, is narrated in the voice of a little Palestinian girl addressing her father. لماذا نحن يا أبتي لماذا نحن أغراب أما لنا في كل هذا الكون أصحاب. At the same time, the cover on the collection is also the creation of one of the most prolific and celebrated Palestinian painters, Ismail Shammout. This is the original. Ismail Shammout, a native of Lidda, was rendered a refugee, and he sought refuge in Gaza in the late 40s, early 50s. He would go on to study in Rome and spend time in Egypt. And he's one of the most celebrated Palestinian artists, along with his artist wife, Tamam al-Akhad. So, as early as these Ismail Shammout's paintings of the period mostly tell his experience of dispossession, of exile. He's a contemporary of Harun Hashim Rashid. Another Gazan is credited with also creating this archive for the Palestinian dispossession that occurred in Gaza, and also at the maltreatment of Arab regimes of certain rebellious Palestinian activists. And I'm speaking of Mouin Bsiso. Mouin Bsiso, born in 1926, similarly experienced multiple dislocations throughout his tumultuous life. A Marxist revolutionary, he bridged the space between being the poet and the activist in pursuit of freedom and liberation. His literary journey began with the publication of his first poems in Jaffa-based magazine Al-Hurriya, Liberty, in 1946. He led multiple activist, rebellious actions against the Egyptian authorities at times when they ruled Gaza, and they prevented Palestinians from returning to their ancestral homes or engaging with the Israeli colonial forces. He continued to explore themes of national liberation, democracy, social progress with his essential poetry. And despite spending a total of 7 years in various prisons due to his commitment to the Palestinian cause, he persisted in his artistic endeavors and in his beliefs in the loud 60s and 70s mode of expression. His works are also translated into multiple languages, including English, French, German, and Russian. He was himself a translator of Russian into Arabic. Of course, he would pass away in the most exilic Palestinian possible way. He would pass away in a hotel room in London. His body would only be found days later because he had the "Don't Disturb" sign on. And in 1967, Israel's occupation of Gaza further fueled Palestinian resistance, drawing global attention to the plight of those living under military rule. The subsequent decades saw grassroots movements like the first Intifada of 1987 sprang from the refugee camp of Jabalia, where Palestinians courageously rose up against the Israeli colonial rule and demanded an end to the occupation. And it is within this occluded, deliberately excised context, resistance movements such as Hamas and others that came into existence as an expression of the frustration, as an expression of the infinitely ghettoized colonial reality forced upon them in the confines of the Gaza Strip. Increasingly, and alongside poetry, since the Oslo Accords allowed the return of various Palestinians from the Shatat, which, unlike other people reluctant to easily translate into diaspora, from the Palestinian Shatat, poetry gave way to more prose and prose fiction. And Gaza became an exporter of short stories. As one short story introduction to a short story collection for writers from Gaza have it. Gaza became an exporter of, one of the biggest exporters of orange and short stories. So, in reading the rich corpus of works published by authors from Gaza in the last 15 years, one might detect what I'm calling a Gazan sensibility, which is quite distinct from, say, the writings of Arabs and Palestinians in the Arab Shatat, or the writings of Palestinians in the Galilee that live under the confines and restrictions of Israeli citizenship. You don't find the dark humor that tries to reconcile the banality of being Palestinian in Israel in the writings of people who write in Gaza and from Gaza. This Gazan sensibility is firmly grounded in the details of the local coffee shops, the narrow alleyways of 18 official and unofficial camps, refugee camps of Gaza. That sensibility favors direct, terse, even austere diction with a meditative bent towards considering a singular event or a central scene. And the centrality of the scene in prose fiction is an observation the late Edward Said made in one of his articles. The scene, according to him, becomes one of the, if not the only, one of the few possible spaces for the Palestinian writer to try to make sense of the fragmentation under which she lives and under which she has to write. One of the best examples of this trend, in my opinion anyway, is Nayrouz Qarmout. Nayrouz was born in Yarmouk refugee camp in Damascus in 1984. She's an award-winning writer, journalist, and a women's rights advocate. And her time outside of Gaza is quite formative. And that transformation from a Palestinian of the Shatat into a Palestinian in Palestine, but in a specific, very specific part of Palestine, produced a host of contradictions for her. And in her writing, she tries to address squarely these contradictions. Her short story collection, The Cloak of the Sea, or The Sea Cloak rather, and The Braid, The Sea Cloak and The Braid, two different stories in the short story collection. They provide invaluable insights into Gaza's challenges, with a particular focus on women's concerns in the ghettoized reality of Gaza. Her work delves into human conflict, historical struggles, and the quest for safety, liberty, and dignity. The titular story, for example, of this collection, Aba'at al-Bahr, The Sea Cloak, offers a poignant and unflinching representation of a simple family day by the beach, and how the teenager woman protagonist tries to enter the water fully clothed, almost drowns, gets saved by a Gazan teenager with her brother watching from afar. It's all told in a very direct yet sensitive diction and tone. She's some critics have compared her vignettes to those of Mahfouz, of Cairo life. So I think, since October 7th, scores if we jump to the present moment, there will be many stories that will be forever left untold because their authors are no longer with us. عمر أبو شويش، عبد الكريم حشاش، إناس السقا، جهاد المصري، شهادة البهبهان، نور الدين حجاج، مصطفى السواف, many more. The conservative total toll stands at 33,000 people killed, 8,000 more unaccounted for, still under the rubble, and some 70,000 people wounded and maimed. In the macabre math of genocide, I started thinking of what is lost. Can it be quantifiable? It would take a good short story writer maybe a week to conceive of a story and write it. We're talking about 100,000 lives altered, lost, ended, how many weeks would it take for how many writers to imagine all these altered life, all these ended life? As I said in the beginning, I found some of my answers elsewhere, not in the US, not necessarily in academia. And in a Thumama complex, the number of evacuees that arrive keep increasing, and there will be a lot of work to be done in archiving their stories and making sure their stories are remembered, are written, and making sure that their traumas are not left unaddressed. It's already getting hot for them in April in Doha. They await the strong sun of the Gulf that ended the lives of the men in the sun inside that tank in the late 50s, according to the logic of that novella. It is uncannily puzzling for any Palestinian, especially someone who's worked on Palestinian culture, to think that the question, what if, is happening? What if the Nakba happens in your life? When you're potentially, ostensibly, ready, prepared, strong, and yet everybody I talk to who is able to do anything is full of shame that we cannot stop at least what's happening. And you know, the story of Palestinians in Gaza is a story of infinitely inspiring resilience. I started with the story of Amina, and Amina is very loud. She's impossible to pin down to a chair, to get her to do anything other than what she decides she wants to do. And it's usually a match between Amina and Ibrahim in the workshop that I facilitate. Ibrahim is 20 years old. He is maimed, he is not a caregiver, and his only surviving limb is his left arm with 3 fingers. And he is full of words. He does not want to stay silent. He is very expressive, and whenever I'm in his presence, I see that he's turned his remaining 3 fingers into fountains of life. And I remember my first time going, I thought, okay, I'm not ready for the traumatic stories, but a writing workshop, what can be unexpected? And then I met Ibrahim, and he only has 3 fingers and he cannot use a pen. And I was, I found it an awkward problem to try to solve. And it turns out he has already solved it. He told me, I will write you a story next week, and I will write it on my phone. And he did. And the following week, he wrote me another story with his surviving 3 fingers. Mind you, Athumama is, while it's a very, as far as these things go, I mean, it's an okay accommodation, but it doesn't have ramps. Ibrahim makes sure that he leaves his building, come on his wheelchair, aided by whoever is nearby, gets up the stairs and down the stairs, with the help of volunteers, because we still don't have ramps. So I think it's important to remember the resilience of Gazans, Palestinians in Gaza. And you know, if this genocide is taken to its logical end, we will have one type of Palestinian experience, and that's of concern to me, and that would be of the Shatat. We will not have Palestinians writing in Palestine about Palestine in Arabic. I think the Zionist insistence on erasing Palestinians once and for all is no longer possible. But it is still possible to reduce the Palestinian experience to an exilic experience that can only occur outside of our ancestral homes, outside of Palestine. And that's a real threat of what's happening right now from perspective of people who care about culture and language and preservation of unique ways of expressing oneself and one's relationship with their ancestral homes. I would like to think that Amina's words are in conversation with some of the murmurs of the ghosts that are still with us in these hallways of the Olodi people. I don't do that performative Berkeley email signature, but as a displaced Palestinian, I very much honor their souls and their ghosts. And I hope that Amina's words are understood by the rest of the Olodi people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed, for such a powerful, personal, and deeply insightful presentation. I have some questions and reflections that I will share with you after the second lecture. And now we go to our second talk for the evening by Professor Stefania Pandolfo. So please join me in welcoming her for the talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, after listening to Ahmed speaking, I feel like addressing what he said rather than reading my talk. At some level, my talk is related to, we didn't talk to each other and we come from very different places and experiences, at least theoretically related to some of the things that he said. And but I will have to read my talk, so maybe we can keep the discussion for later. But I wanted to say how much I appreciated your courage to actually not to speak directly of hope, and also your courage in thinking about the importance of language and writing. And what can keep a culture alive that might be possibly transmitted, and what does it mean to eradicate a culture. And I appreciated so much what you said about the dark humor, and the willingness to look into an apocalyptic moment in an apocalyptic way. So my talk is called Open Our Eyes. As I speak about trauma in Palestine, as someone who is here in Berkeley, now not there, even though, one second. As a person who's here in Berkeley, not there, even though here, as we were reminded yesterday, tax day is April 15th, there were protests on the freeways and on the bridges because this is an American war. And here is deeply entangled with there. And as I speak as someone who's not Palestinian and does not usually write about Palestine, but I write about Morocco, where Gaza is nonetheless felt as a knot in the stomach, and where Palestine has been on everyone's mind for the last several decades. I must first of all acknowledge my incapacity, my own, an incapacity, my own, and an inadequacy, that of the word trauma, to grasp what for the last 6 and a half months, and for the last 75 years has been the attempt at the obliteration of a people, of a place, and a form of life. For trauma, in the everyday sense that we use, not in the list of words associated to trauma that we did in my class that actually exceeded the everyday sense of trauma, and some of my students are here and I thank them for that. But trauma in its everyday sense, as we read in the book Empire of Trauma, and in its application to the sites of humanitarian disaster, has been normalized to become one of the experiential and institutional frames through which we do not see. 193 days of relentless bombing. Every day we wake up to the announcement of the number of the counted newly dead, and many more uncounted under the rubble, in that housing complex, in that neighborhood of refugee camp, in that hospital, in that market. In Gaza, where every hospital and school and church and mosque and university has been bombed, and for the most part destroyed, where people have been forced to evacuate to then be bombed again as they move to find precarious shelter and are struck again, where the survivors are deprived of food, water, and medicine and are facing starvation, and where every living person knows that they may be tomorrow's dead, where every utterance and every photograph is testamentary, aware that there may be the once last word and once last family portrait, where there is no end in sight, other than what appears to be the end itself. And yet, despite it all, the signs of insistent life, a desire for living, a young man's open smile today on Al Jazeera as he shows to the journalist the bag of bread that he was able to procure after many hours of waiting in line. Or the artist who makes puppets with empty hands for children to play. With the felt incapacity and the inadequacy of concepts comes a sense of urgency manifesting itself as a knot in the stomach, also mine. To speak about trauma in Palestine today, we must be able to bear witness to the dead. And as we speak about Gaza on this campus, in this room, in our classes, we must visualize that we're evoking a place where every classroom and every school, every library and every book are in the process of being destroyed, and that a large number of school children and students, teachers, writers, and poets, as Ahmed was actually naming, have been killed. The Palestinian poet Musab Abu Toha was in Gaza until he was detained and tortured by the Israeli army while evacuating with his family from Gaza City to Khan Khamis in the south. At the beginning of the war on Gaza, he had published a powerful essay, The View from My Window in Gaza, that my students also read this semester, where he narrated in an intimate mode how he returned to his apartment after a bombing to get some food left in the refrigerator, and he meditated by his library on the lives gone in his deserted neighborhood. From Cairo, where he is now, he posts daily updates on social media, which he comments in laconic sentences, sometimes short poems. Quote, I look at my city, it lies in ruins. I imagine the heap of concrete as puzzle pieces, but they are disfigured and there is no place for me to sit down and reassemble them. April 11. Quote, the breaking news about our death and our wounds and the decimation of our lives has become so familiar that is not stopping even for a minute. April 12. I'm thinking here of two videos that he posted in the last week. The first of a woman kneeling on a prayer rug in the midst of the debris of a collapsed building. A mother, Abu Toha says in his notes on his post, who went out to look for food for her children. And when she came back for food, a bomb had struck the neighborhood from the sky, and her 3 children were buried under the rubble. In the video, she kneels up and down as if praying, as if attempting to contain an internal explosion, while people ran around searching for bodies. I'm not sure she was praying, she's doing it too fast. A second video showed to those who opened it the scene of devastation at the market in Gaza, Fras Souk, when the second day of the Eid, just this week, a bombardment struck when people were shopping for presents. The shattered remains of a young man being carried in a blanket, and a note from Abu Toha pointing us to the clothes hanged for sale, the toys, sign of life interrupted, and yet the signs that there was and there remain a will to live. In another post, immediately after, he wrote, just posted a video from today's massacre. Please witness. What are we asked to do by witnessing? And this is the question that Ahmed was asking. What does it mean to witness? And I will try to answer this question. I will not be able to answer this question because this is an impossible question to answer. In her essay, Witnessing Death in Tantura, Samara Smeir, who spoke just before us a couple of weeks ago here, writes of the insistence of the disconnected and symptomatic memories of the survivors of the massacre perpetrated during the night on May 22, 1948, in the village of Tantura in historic Palestine. During the year of conquest, or the year of catastrophe, Nakba, when the Alexandronic brigades of the not yet established state of Israel killed the majority of the village inhabitants after they had surrendered, leaving behind the few surviving witnesses. The exceptional acts of killing, as they were called in the dissertation that was written about this, were unearthed by an Israeli graduate student researching for an MA at the University of Haifa in the 1990s, who interviewed the survivors as well as the veterans of the Palestinian survivors, as well as the veterans of the Alexandronic brigades. While the survivors remembered in fragments charged with affect in physical and visual ways, but were unable to produce a coherent account of the event, the perpetrator denied the killing. On the basis of the MA's thesis and of the testimony provided by the graduate student himself, his name is Theodore Katz, a court of law disavowed the reality of the massacre because of the incoherence of the survivors' testimonies and the graduate student's internal doubt as to what counted as witnessing the real. And indeed, his MA's thesis was also rescinded, so his diploma was rescinded. Yet, Samira Esmail reminds us in her essays the failure to acknowledge the reality of the massacre had to do with the inability to open one's eyes and ears and hear the testimony of the survivors as survivors in the unfinished temporality of surviving. For as survivors, they were not external to the event, as it was required for an external evidentiary proof validated in linear secular time, but they were instead connected to the dead, in a space of the living permeated by the presence, absence of the dead. In that space, between life and death, the lacunary nature of the survivor's testimony is the very mode of bearing witness to both the dead and the event. In this sense, as Mary tells us, it is in this sense, she says, that in the year of catastrophe, quote, the memories of the Tantura survivors stood in striking resistance to the catastrophe itself, the Nakba, which caused the blurring of the living and the dead and the end of social relationships. The possibility of living was precisely located in the insistence of those memories that bore witness to a traumatic connection, an unrelinquished bond in the mode of survival. It was a scattering of lives into fragments that called for the utopian imagination of a common world, a world of the living, the dead, and the unborn. So what does it mean to reclaim the concept of trauma, the concept that I was saying at the beginning that it's incapable or is inadequate to talk about such experiences? What does it mean to read Freud anew? What does it mean to speak of trauma from a space of catastrophe? And in light of some psychoanalysts or psychotherapists or writers who have written of trauma in the wake of catastrophic experience, what does it mean to speak of a language of trauma, a traumatic connection? It could be said that Freud's psychoanalysis, if we take it in a radical sense, a sense that was received by Frantz Fanon, and in a different way by Edward Said, in his remarkable lecture, Freud and the Non-European. It could be said that Freud's psychoanalysis is a call for opening our eyes to a confusing and uncertain present, and to bear witness to the dead. As Freud put it in his famous essay, Thoughts for the Time on War and Death, and I just cite the first few words of that essay, in the confusion of wartime in which we are caught up, relying as we must on one-sided information, standing too close to the great changes that have already taken place or are beginning to, and without the glimmering of the future that is being shaped, we ourselves are at a loss as to the significance of the impressions, the memory traces, it means, which press in upon us, and to the value of the judgment that we form. Science herself has lost her passionate impartiality. Her deeply embittered servants seek weapons from her with which to contribute towards the struggle with the enemy. I will not be able to talk about this, but Freud goes on to question or to think the kind of ethical insights that can be achieved from the midst of the space of confusion. And the ethical insight is about the implication of the combatant and the non-combatant into a relation to violence that is disavowed. And then he goes on to reflect on what does mourning mean, and in what sense it would be possible for a veteran to come back having killed and reflect on the killing without disavowing the killing, but also without disavowing the fact of having killed. And what would it mean from that point of view to encounter violence as something which is everywhere, but it can be looked at with open eyes. Similarly, it talks about the small achievement to give death its place in the actuality and inner thought which belong to it, for instance. And he concludes his essay by saying, if you want end by saying that it is necessary to ponder death, to to give death its due, or to witness death, or to not to bracket this question. And we have Fanon on the question of the gaze and the psychic intrusion in the psychopolitical configuration of the colony as another way that is profound, that is Freudian, that is profoundly influenced by this Freudian insight of understanding violence. And his reflections on the case studies from the Blida Psychiatric Hospital in Algeria on the unfinished colonial war and what he called the indelible wounds that we must continue to treat in the ethical political task of the decolonial project of repair. He is pondering of his patients' hallucinations and traumatic delusions, bearing witness to what he calls une apocalypse véritable, a veritable apocalypse, which suggests that unless we can actually enter the space of that veritable apocalypse, we will not be able to encounter the experience of war. Fanon went as far as saying in this incredible case studies that he wrote, that are case studies of trauma in which there is no discourse on trauma, to say that the witnessing that is given in the delusional testimony of the patients is the only way that we really have to have a sense of the experience of total war in a colonial war. So that actually delusion is the only access that we have to that experience. And then the last question that I have in this context is, what does it mean to witness as an image? When I was quoting Abu Toha, the poet who writes his short poems in relation to images that he puts on the internet, and those images are images that are straight out of videos that are recorded on the street, and yet they are mediated by his words. And in what sense, what does it mean? What is the testimony of the image, and what is our responsibility to this? And I want to conclude on this after I have one more section, and then I will try to address that. My third section is called Apocalyptic Witnessing. I want to turn to witnessing Gaza in Morocco, where I have written about, where I spent a large part of my life. Through the words of a Quran scholar and a therapist with whom I've been engaged in conversation for many years, who is a central voice in my book, Not of the Soul. I call him the Imam in my book, and I have been talking with him for over 10 years. He lives in a poor neighborhood in the outskirts of the city of Salah, and not far from the psychiatric hospital where I did research, and he practices the cures of the soul, which are the cures of madness, and they also imply relating to spirit possession, to the spirits, and performing the liturgy of the Ruqiyya, which is the recital of the Quran on the side of the sick. He has, as I wrote in my book, he stressed on imagination. He has a stress in the way in which he talks about his cure on the nature of imagination. Imagination as what forms the experience of a person, both in this world and towards the other. The imagination as that which can close the capacity to receive the Quran, the divine message, but the imagination is also that which can open the heart. And he talks about images as alienating impressions or alienating imprints that imprison and colonize the subject and the soul, and as liberating impressions, different kinds of images, disalienating, emancipatory images that open the heart, which instead expand the soul and make it capable to see and receive the divine interpellation. With him, I had learned to approach trauma differently, through the concept of the ordeal, a divine trial of the soul that becomes visible through illness, as he put it, and which is captured by the Quranic concept of ibtila, a divine testing of or trial, which encodes the cardinal orientation of thinking and practice vis-a-vis a theological, but also the existential problem of suffering. And in fact, when I understood the importance of this concept of the ordeal in relation to his thinking about intergenerational trauma, spirit possession, and everything, I realized that then it has to do with the kind of opening up of temporality in which another horizon was posed for the imagination of existence, and that it was an open-ended horizon. Now in November, this last November, I went to see him when I was in Rabat for a long time, when the Shifa hospital in Gaza was under siege and the children were left to die in one of the war cruelest chapters. Morocco was shaken by protests against the war and against the normalization with Israel. People gathered to watch the news from Palestine. The war broadcasted live. Many people were sick with anxiety and somatic symptoms that were bearing witness physically in a certain way to the experience of people in Gaza, directly affected by the plight of Palestinians. The Imam said that the emotion of watching the war on Gaza from a distance produces a shock, and that shock could itself break the person. There needed to be a balance between emotion, as he put that, atifa, and faith, iman, aqidah, or the flooding of the emotions that were triggered by the destruction of Gaza would overwhelm the soul and cause illness, depression, madness, and suicide. He spoke fast, and what he said had a different quality than in our previous conversations. His reading was more directly political and eschatological. Gaza's tragedy was the window into an otherworldly scene which unfolded before our eyes and in the midst of ruins. His words were addressed at the people losing hope, drowning in the catastrophe that was imposed upon them. They provided, to use his word, a shield of faith to contain the overwhelming emotions of the war, the sense of ending and despair. And that not just for people in Morocco or in Gaza, because he saw himself as speaking also to people in Gaza, but for the therapist himself. And so I cited him. God forbid, he was talking so fast, and he asked me to turn on my tape recorder, and there I was, and it just went, and it was a sermon. God forbids injustice, zulm, and yet no Western country has stepped in to stop the slaughtering of Palestinians. If we don't put an end to injustice, God will not forgive us, because God created us siblings, akhwa, as human beings. But being human is not just a giving. It means to act as human, feed the hungry, give water to the thirsty, care for the wounded and the ones in need. If you don't do all this, we are not human, and God will not forgive us. The world must change from this evil. Gaza is an example for the world. It makes visible the harm done to innocent people. And God will judge the perpetrators and most of those who seek to obliterate Palestine from the map. The truth, he continues, is now apparent. There is only one power on this planet, and it's the United States. And the brothers cannot succor each other because they are themselves conquered. They're powerless. We hate this war. The children burned and killed, the hospitals violated and destroyed, but God knows best. And looking at the destruction in Gaza from the perspective of God, he sees the neighborhoods and the ruins of Gaza visited by angels who come to succor the suffering, visit the hospitals, and alleviate the pain of children. The destruction of Gaza and the plight of the Palestinian people are an ordeal for him, a trial of suffering seen from the perspective of faith, reveals a divine interpellation, and for those who are willing to read it, the enigma of divine love. I quote him, Palestinians have endured for 75 years in the position as guardians of the sacred home at Beit al-Maqdisi, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Prophet Muhammad started his mystical journey to the seventh sky and the divine real, an honor that comes with the highest price of dispossession and forced exile. They were expelled, their homes and orchards were taken from them, their olive groves were burned, their sons were imprisoned, they were beaten and wounded. And now God says to the angels, they have endured may they come to me as my guests. And the angels bring them directly to God and have a place among the blessed. God loves the people of Gaza. It brings it back to the Quranic story of Yusuf and the trials that Yusuf had to endure without losing his faith. And he concludes with the image of a woman giving birth that stunningly sort of contrasts everything else that he has been saying through a near-death experience in which she is actually hoping to die because it is too painful. And then the smile, he says, the smile on her face when the baby comes out, when it is born, a smile from her heart. So, how to conclude this? For me, listening to the Imam was at the same time intensely moving and even shattering, and also pointed to a fundamental change in the way in which he has been talking about this, as if the intense abyssal horror of what he had been watching every day on TV and what has been happening to people in Gaza and what has been happening to people that he felt profoundly for was so impossible to address from within this world that he needed a leap to the beyond. A leap to the beyond that was no longer the leap, which was the opening to the question of ibtila, of the question of the ordeal as an interpellation, as a question for which we have no answer, but we know that God will have an answer, but there is a gap. There is something that we will never know of our living, but it is a question that now has been somewhat answered by an extreme pain that has requested the coming of the angels in the middle of the ruins. And so I kept wondering, and I don't know how to answer, and I kept wondering for days now, what is my answer to this question? And in what sense do I want to reclaim the other meaning of the ordeal, which allows for meeting the angels in a space in which there is a possibility for life on this earth. And so, to conclude, I decided to myself go to the work of poets. Even some of the poets were disappeared, but to the work of poets who thought about the possibility of creation in the space of the coerced imagination, the writings of Mahmoud Darwish himself, the work of poets who thought that form itself, the capacity to shape or compress experience, has the capacity, the force of angels, has the force of carving for us a space on this earth and waiting for the beyond in the very time in which we also can witness our and others' death. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you both, Ahmed and Stefania, for such thoughtful, deeply thoughtful, but also I think is proper ways of coming at this topic, especially in this time. Like that, this is an event about literature and trauma, but fundamentally, both of you are bringing our attention to problematizing the crisis of representation, paradigms of thinking trauma, the role really of literature to testify, or kind of like the reason for testifying, and what testifying does. So in a way, I do appreciate that both your lectures, in a way, doesn't let us do that move of, or like do the step of thinking past or moving past. That yes, it's concluding kind of lectures, events, but nothing is concluded, nothing is conclusive. It's there. It's in the now. You mentioned when you were commenting about Ahmed's lecture, you said it's like the refusal of the note of hope, the refusal of just, think in the standard ways of trauma, and then talking about literature and how it kind of practices a type of healing that fundamentally, yes, leaves the audience with a note of hope, but then is incongruent with what's happening outside. Right? So in that sense, I do appreciate the force of both your lectures and the directions that they take. So I just have a couple of remarks, kind of questions, invitations to reflect a little bit further, and then I will open for questions from the audience. So just for Ahmed, along the same line of the idea of the crisis of representation. I personally was touching to see your choice of transcribing to us or like relaying to us the Arabic words and story of Amina, but without translating it. And you added to untranslate it, and you were bringing back some reflections on the ethicality of narrating the stories. But still, to me, like you mentioned you are an educator and you are a translator, and you mentioned that you were there in a writing workshop. So I'm just reflecting in terms of you could elaborate more on that, the kind of work that literature was doing there, at least in that space of the writing workshop. And maybe it's helpful to think of distinction between the writing act and the written, and who owns the written kind of thing, and what's the ethicality of passing down the written, bringing it and translating it to an audience, versus the writing act and what it does to the different Palestinian children that you were working with. And my second, I was really, it was arresting to me to hear you talk about, and I think it's a brilliant point about what you said, a sensibility, a Ghazan sensibility in terms of literature or aesthetic, or a Ghazan aesthetic, and the fact that, as you mentioned, Gaza is, as the saying goes, the land of origin, oranges and short stories. And I wanted you to reflect a little bit why the short story, in the sense that, in a way, you began to give us answers to why, because you mentioned intensity, and in a way, the short story is that, it's the genre of the snapshot, of the punch, of the immediate. It's not the genre of process, of like taking, passage of time and thinking and reflection. No, it's the genre of the radical, and the radical, or let me say, it's the genre of the immediate. And Gaza is the space of the radical, and the radical is always immediate, and it's always a gut. You said, I think you opened the lecture with a punch. It felt like, the knot in the soul, that intensity, that immediacy, and it's also the immediate of what is constantly happening again and again and again. So no space to reflect and establish a process, right? So if you just have some reflection on that, the short story there and its significance. And for Stefania, very interesting take to look at to think the psychoanalytical framework and the perception of what's happening in Gaza from Morocco, and in a lot of ways you and Ahmed, even though I know you have not read each other's presentations, you were like in dialogue already in your own lectures. And to me, again, if you could just say something to how the standard, Freudian way of coming at trauma might not be helpful in the context of what we are perceiving, in the sense, in the Freudian scholarship on trauma and trauma studies, that yes, the experience is radical, the experience is structured through a fundamental unknowability, fundamental forgetting, it's singular, and that's why it comes back. While here, it's a case where trauma, there's no fundamental unknowability. Trauma is there, and it's expected, and it's coming, and it's understood, and it's not just because that it's war, as it has been said, it's war and the civilians die in war, but fundamentally because there is that sense of an international consensus of the radical disposability of Palestinian lives, that trauma is not just war, that the war will exert a radical price kind of thing. So in a way, and also the fact that you mentioned shahada, and it's so interesting to think of shahada and witnessing, but to go back to the idea, the root word, the root origins of shahada, and fundamentally that the notion of shaheed, witness, and you drew on a number of Islamic moral literature that witness, the shaheed is one of the 99 names, or divine names. And there, if you look up the explanation for that, is that, well, the divine is the shaheed because the divine is the all-knowing. So the divine is the witness in every case of injustice. So the witness is not the one who didn't know, actually, like in the Freudian analysis, the witness and the one who experienced trauma is the one who almost has this moral responsibility of this total knowledge of what happened, what will come, and what's taking place. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that. And also finally, and we still have time for audience conversation. Sorry. But it's fascinating to me too to think about the significance of Gaza for the Maghreb, the images of Gaza in the Maghreb, and why in the Maghreb those images kind of evoke something of the present, something of the past, the colonial experience in the Maghreb that is very radical as opposed to other Arab states like Algeria, settler colonialism. And something of futurity as well. There's this deep connection between the colonial experience of the Maghreb and Palestine that I would like to hear more about from just your reflections or experience during this time in the ways in which Gaza evokes that deep sense of the experience of coloniality in the Maghreb. So those would be my two, kind of my comments, questions, and feel free to address them however, in whatever order you like, before we go. The workshop, the writing, the experience of the workshop.
The workshop, I mean, it was a little deliberate on my part to end on Men in the Sun. And for those who know the story, there is that. It's a story written by Kanafani in the early 60s. It takes place 10 years after the expulsion of 1948, so roughly 1958, according to the logic of the story. And these three Palestinians, still refugees, still struggling after 10 years, they decide there's an oil rush in Kuwait, and they, like many other Palestinians, decide to go to Kuwait. And the only way to get to Kuwait is by getting smuggled. Things go wrong, and the way they get smuggled is they get a smuggler to hide them inside a water tank. The smuggler himself is Palestinian. And the story ends with them dying out of suffocation inside the water tank at the border crossing because the driver takes too long. But it ends on this question: why did they not knock to alert other people to come to the rescue? And that's the question remains open. لماذا لم يدقوا جدران الخزان? And I think one of the ways Palestinian Shatat has given life to new forms of being Palestinian in the world, at least according to me, is that these evacuees from Gaza, they're here, they're knocking, and their knocks should be heeded, should be answered. And one of the ways they can be answered is, at least according to me, is I am also a Palestinian refugee. Incidentally, I'm also a victim of a violent crime. I could relate to a lot of the stories that they bring with them. And I thought, I wasn't sure this would be useful at all. I would get any teenagers to come. But on the whole, it was, I think, generative and fruitful for everybody involved.
The choice to write all in Fusha, there was no dialectical conversation.
That choice was left up to them, and I actually made a point of asking them to write in whatever comes to their mind. They want to write in the colloquial, they want to write in the fusha. So they produced whatever they produced. Not everyone wrote. Not some people stormed out at a certain point in the discussion. They couldn't. They were overcome by certain memories. It was Anas. Anas was, he smuggled his way. He's not a caregiver, sorry, or a wounded person. He has that slight demeanor to him. But the minute we started talking about their traumatic experiences, he couldn't. Ultimately, he shared with us. He left and came back. That he couldn't save his cousins. He could only save his brother. So it was not a tidy or predictable process in any way. And I thought the writing would serve two points, two purposes. Would be creating some kind of an informal archive. And we, because of the many episodes of dislocation and dispossession that Palestinian history has, I know from my training and from my work that we've had documentaries about the children of Shatila. We've had documentary work done with Palestinians right after a massacre, right after a violent episode. And that was sort of an inspiration for me. So I thought writing would be therapeutic. That's the other side. That it would, there's this theory that if you take 30 minutes for 4 consecutive days and write down whatever comes to your mind about that traumatic experience, you slowly begin to reframe it. And that was very ambitious on my part to think that I can get them to write for 4 days in a row about that. So I thought it would serve these two purposes: create some kind of informal archive and help them deal with some of these traumatic experiences that they by default, by the built-in filter of them arriving in Doha, they all have.
So in that way, in that sense, I personally appreciate you presenting to us the written in its non-communicability as part of that writing act of those people, and not just for us to kind of expand upon. It's there as part of the extension of that writing act for them, versus something to be more diffused, and then different forms of performativity would be attached to it. Yes.
Absolutely. And I before coming back to the States, I asked them if they wanted to share anything with the audience or share anything with anyone in America. They wrote down some sentences, but they didn't want to be on camera, and they're still very uncertain about their fate, what would happen to them. But I think in terms of writing and withholding translation, I think it's a technique used more often in cinema, and I do feel that they feel very alienated. Even though I am Palestinian, I sit with them and they were comfortable in a certain way, but they come from a very specific experience of being Palestinian. It's a very it's a sealed off place that they come from. So I felt that perhaps one of the ways I can communicate the sense of alienation they have is by withholding translation from the audience. I don't know to what degree of success that was achieved, but
I think
yeah. These are some of the thoughts that I had in mind, and it's an unfinished work.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you. I don't know. Maybe Stefania will tell us something about.
Yeah, we'll come to your questions.
The usefulness or uselessness or possibilities, impossibilities of
Freudian paradigms.
Oh, I thought you wanted to know.
Or in conversation with Ahmad, as just said, which is even more important.
Well, let me answer, we'll begin to answer some of your questions quickly. I say, I'm not convinced that that in what I try to write, I want to part company so radically with psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis is important for me. And as a practice of the unconscious, of that which eludes the mastery of the subject, and of something which always exceeds the possibility of saying, or something which it's always another scene for the subject that is beyond, and the possibility of that beyond, or having concepts that for us point to the possibility of that beyond is fundamental. And in fact, it's precisely the importance of this that has led me to then listen to dimensions of Quranic therapeutical practices that speak of a different beyond, but attempt to carve a space for carve a space for an expansion in an unknown direction. So for me, if there is a possible dialogue, or at least there has been for me, then there has certainly been for me in my life. And then if I have written about these things, it's because I thought that maybe this might be interesting for others. The fact that it was possible, instead of simply saying, oh, these are cultural practices of different sorts, and psychoanalysis or different forms of psychotherapy. We are in the Bay Area, there are so many of them, and psychoanalysis is actually to some extent obsolete, right? It's something from, and that may be why it's interesting, because there is something which is almost beyond our time. I think that it would be then interesting to see, instead of saying these are completely different ways of thinking, if there is a kind of some point of encounter politically or existentially. And politically, for me, it was clear that quite quickly my way of understanding the practice of the unconscious went against the way in which a large majority of psychoanalysis understood the practice of the clinic, particularly in the Middle East and in Morocco as well. So I found myself doing research in Morocco, working both in a psychiatric hospital with psychiatrists, with patients, and it was not an asylum, so people would come and go. They would be in the emergency room, they would stay for 3 weeks and then leave. And then talking with psychoanalysts who once upon a time were in the hospital, and in fact had a relation with that experience of alterity, which is the experience of the hospital, with a certain dimension of incurability, and which is the experience of the hospital, and having to live with it, having to sit with it, having to sort of ponder it instead of attempting to simply resolve it. So sort of studying oneself as both a practitioner and, for me, as an ethnographer of those practices in a different temporality, in a temporality of non-resolution, attempting to give up the desire for immediate healing or my desire to make change in someone's life, which it did happen because it did happen in some of the stories that I wrote about the patients. In fact, there were those moments. But with the psychoanalysts, there is the whole question, which is very much ongoing today, right, about the fact that the psychoanalysis is secular. Is it even, what is the unconscious secular? Well, I would maintain that if this means anything, the unconscious is not secular. And that it is one of those concepts that do not fit a linear secular temporality, and
So in that
would
sense,
lead us
yeah.
to think otherwise. But then they're used in certain ways, and I criticize such ways. But I also don't want to give up the concept of the unconscious. I want to reclaim it. I wanted to illuminate it or reread it from a perspective that is displaced in relation to it. And it might be the perspective of your deal. It might be the perspective of Ibtila. So it is the perspective of the cures. But that was about which I wrote and that I sat with for many years. But this is my, in a way, against the grain attempt to reclaim both the concept of trauma understood as catastrophe or understood as an encounter with something bigger, so that, as you were saying, there is a whole literature, I don't know if I'm sure you're familiar, but there is a book by Kathy Caruth, Listening to Trauma, but there are interviews with major figures in the history of the thought about trauma, and some of them have worked on catastrophic experience. So, for instance, Robert Lifton, who wrote on Hiroshima, who wrote on the Vietnam War, who wrote on the question of the survivor, and talked about shame, and talked about the loss of feeling in the aftermath of a traumatic encounter or a traumatic event, which is an encounter with death, who attempted to bring back the question of death to the forefront of the experience. And then, there are other authors such as, who have written on sexual trauma and things such as. And in my classes, when I teach about these questions, the question often emerges, how can we talk about one trauma and another trauma? Even if we want to use the word, a collective trauma of an immense experience, as what we were talking about, or surviving the Vietnam War, and the fact of having a different kind of trauma, a trauma that could be an accident, right? A trauma that could be something that is understood in our way of thinking within the sphere of private life. But then maybe trauma exceeds the sphere of private life. It really depends how we think those things. Maybe they are more commensurable. Maybe we should think the one and the other together, but beyond the sphere of private life. Maybe there is something that exceeds and that is beyond the individual, right? That it is beyond. So that is the sense in which, and I think that Freud himself, and that's why I go to Fanon. I mean, for Fanon, it's clear that if we want to think about this question, and Fanon does not give up the concept of trauma. I mean, very clearly keeps, at the center of his thinking, black skin, white mask, particularly, his case studies and in some of his clinical studies.
But also his refusal that
but it goes
in the Martinique that he says there is not a single case of audible cure.
Of course, yeah, it does. It keeps the concept of trauma, but he rethinks it in terms of sociology. And what he calls sociology is the fact that we live in a world where there are fantasies, there are projected fantasies of the colonizer that are the air that we breathe. And then how do we traverse the air that we breathe? And yet, there is something about the intrusion of those thoughts. Some of the writings of Fanon on dreams, the dreams of the colonized in Black Skin, White Mask, for instance, are intrusive dreams that simply bring the dreamer back to the situation of the war, of this, dreaming a gun instead of dreaming a symbol. The complete impasse of symbolic thinking. But then I think that, so what do I stand on this? Well, I stand at some level with my students, for whom the concept is important. We were just doing an experiment in my class on this. And with just people who use it in their life because it is politically relevant, if it is in the sense in which it has been reclaimed and reappropriated in Black studies, for instance, the concept, and in the work of some important thinkers, as Hortense Spiller, for instance, right, and their views of the concept of trauma. And then at the same time, in a critical mode, which is the concept of trauma is bound to the concept of the victim. which is, I mean, if there was something important in what I mean, there are many things important in my encounter with the Imam that I was, including my angst in relation to something that was being, to a transformation of this imagination. But there's also the fact that imagination is deployed to undo the experience of the victim, to reject the concept of a victim, to actually produce 45 images that can undo the sort of the internal subjugation, that can undo the temptation of despair, but also the instrumentalization of the work of the NGOs. Also the whole, the workshops on trauma and thinking smart about healing. And in what sense does it mean, that does make sense, I think, at this moment to radicalize the thinking of trauma and say, well, no, that is not what we're talking about. We're talking about something very different. I want to keep calling it trauma because I actually think that maybe I will change my mind, maybe I will abandon it. Already in my book, I call it something, I try to invent words for it, but
I personally think you made very successful use of trauma into the ordeal, and bringing it into the conversation with the Islamic theories of how to make it sense of the traumatic. So in a way that your lecture itself does that work.
But I do think, because you were telling me, Freud, I actually think I talked about thought for the time of war and death, because that is, a very uncanny text of Freud, in which he's actually undoing the logic of Western liberalism in the context of the First World War, and sort of basically calling each of us to come to terms with the question of violence in a different way, and then to take responsibility for one's own violence and as well, and the projection of this violence. That is a text that in the context of what's happening today in Gaza is important to reread. But also, some of Freud's texts about trauma, particularly his late texts about trauma, was the bringing to the fore of the concept of the death drive as an enigma, which is not an individual enigma, but it's an enigma that concerns life forms even, and not just even human collectivities. I think there is much to think there. So, the second question that
I think we only have 10 minutes for Q&A. So
okay,
just
so let's go to Q&A.
It was about what Gaza represents about the coloniality in general in the Maghreb, but maybe you can come back to it in the Q&A.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry.
No, it's very beautiful stuff. So just open the floor for any questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Diab and Dr. Pandolfo, for your lecture today. I guess what your lecture reminded me of is something that I read in my rhetoric class last semester. It was Sophocles' Philoctetes. It talks about trauma and pain as well, but it also shows the expression of trauma as a form of rhetoric, and how making other people empathize with their pain is something that has to be done effectively for other people to truly believe what you're saying. And we see this with the Gazans every day as well, with how even though their suffering is clearly visible, as is with Philoctetes, they still need to find the correct words to say to make the Western world or anyone believe what they're feeling. So my question is what happens to your trauma when you need to use it to make other people believe it, to frame your pain to make it more easily understandable to others?
Yeah, go ahead. It's a very important question.
It's It is a very important question. I sense with this assault on Palestinian life, I sense amongst colleagues and people in solidarity with me as a Palestinian or with people in Gaza, as Palestinians undergoing genocide, a move in the opposite direction, a move away from trying to find every possible way to express your trauma in an intelligible way to the West. I think there's a fault line that is becoming visible between the global South and the West in ways that we haven't seen in a really long time, or perhaps never before. And you see that with South Africa and Ireland as political entities and how they acted vis-a-vis Palestine, vis-a-vis Gaza. I don't think that I don't think that was the result of framing the Palestinian suffering in a certain way, as much as an intersection of experience, of colonial experience in these three places, Palestine, Ireland, and South Africa. And that's something that's happening, I think, in a scale that we haven't seen before. Rather than cultural affinity with neighboring Arabs, for example, you have a different type of affinity that's shaping solidarity, work around solidarity. And that's based on shared historical experience, more than geographic proximity to the location of the atrocities. I don't know why that is. I don't know why Palestinians are reluctant to expend extra effort to present themselves as humans, because I think in essence this is what the premise of this demand requires and requests. I think Palestinians realize that they are fully human, and the recognition of their humanity falls fully and squarely on the beholder of their condition. And that's why I left Amina's words in Arabic untranslated.
Very much agree with what Ahmed said, and I think that this is a tricky, right? It's the title of my talk was "Opening Your Eyes," because actually posing oneself as the subject wanting to be recognized in one's suffering is a way of closing one's eyes. And so there is, in a certain sense, a refusal to use the figure of recognition. And in the way in which we, both of us, and we have been talking about trauma, we have been using the word, but we have not been using it in that sense. And that's why Wajdi is asking us whether we should drop the word. But
as you already did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah. So the question for me, for instance, when I didn't talk so much in my lecture about this because it was just hard for me to write it this way. But there was a fundamental question that I was trying to address that I didn't foreground, which is the question of the place of the image in this. The question of what is the witnessing? So when I was saying, please witness, what does it mean? What does it mean to please witness? Please witness with an image. Will that image be a testimony that is actually allow for the legal recognition of a happening, as in the case of Tantura I was talking about, where the recognition fails because actually the happening is something that eludes that logic, right? To recognize the massacre of Tantura would mean to be able to listen to the dead the dead are not listened to in that mode, and therefore the massacre in that mode cannot be recognized. So what other different politics can we think about in that context? And the question of the image is when, I have been working with friends from an anonymous documentary film collective from Syria that has been filming for Abu Nadara, yes, that has been filming for between 2010 and 2017 before the revolution, during the revolution, and through the civil war, attempting not to film in the mode of recognition of a traumatic condition that can be translated to the West as something that then becomes the basis for a claim, an identity claim that would increase the violence, or a claim about the pleasure that is extracted from the spectacle of others suffering. And the constraints to what does it mean to use an image that will not do that. I would call it, a desalienating image, an image that does not imprison, but an image that eludes the possibility of fixing it and allow for the expression of a humanity that does not ask to be recognized as human, and yet it addresses us as human. Has to do with requirements of form, has to do with the poetics of the image, has to do with the practice of montage, has to do with not simply thinking that reality is transparent and we just take pictures and share them on the internet, because that is what gives the truth to the event. The truth to the event is more complicated, in fact. To be able to produce an image that is capable to convey an experience, it may be much harder than it seems.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes.
Ahmed, I wanted you to expand. You said they no longer search or at least find some of your answers in academia. And I wanted to expand on that, considering that there's only one president of a university that said something about the destruction of Gaza's universities. And how does that, especially in this current period, academic, where you're concerned about everything, but insisting on literally almost erasing Palestine within an academic setting?
Thank you. I mean, you know probably more than anybody in the room how hard it is to be a Palestinian in an American university. It has never been easy to be a Palestinian in any role in an American university. We're whatever achievements, whatever accomplishments we have that allows us to have this marginal space has been fought really hard for decades. It's still we're still on the very, very fringe, very far fringe margin of American university campus life in so many ways. I think I'm not alone in being in expressing disillusionment in the promise of that utopian campus life in America. As you said, the universities in Gaza are all destroyed. Hardly anybody has uttered a word of condemnation, of solidarity, of sympathy. We are not seen as fully equal, as peers, as even credible, whether as scholars or many of us as citizens. And if you travel the world, those of us who travel the world realize how outside of certain places in the US, planet America is very inward-looking, very self-obsessed, very absorbed, and to me, the academic life is the antithesis to this kind of condition. And in my own experience, I haven't found anywhere outside of certain pockets of Manhattan that transcends this inward-looking American way of analyzing things. Even our the terms that we use, decolonial this and decolonial that, the minute you leave the American Academy, you discover treasure, a world of other ways of decolonizing the mind, of talking about the same problems that we try to engage with. So I am finding my answers elsewhere, and I'm seeking my answers elsewhere, because it is liberating in more meaningful ways. And it doesn't imprison you in intellectually or physically the way being a Palestinian academic in an American university does these days.
Thank you. And on that note, please join me in thanking our speakers for today.
And on behalf of my other colleagues from MELC who organized this series, I want to thank again our speakers, discussants, the audience. And when we start this series in February, well, we didn't imagine that we would be where we are right now, where we think that the need to speak about Palestine is even bigger than before. So please check our events from Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures Department. There will be more talks, more workshops, teachings about Palestine. Thank you.